The waiting room smelled like eucalyptus and quiet intentions. A diffuser hummed softly in the corner, releasing a slow stream of herbal mist into the air. The furniture was minimal but warm, soft beige tones, rounded edges, nothing too sharp, nothing too clinical. A small clock ticked steadily above the doorway, its sound just low enough to notice if you were trying not to notice anything else. I sat with my knees tightly crossed, hands clutching my purse in my lap like a life vest. The clipboard they'd handed me was filled out, my handwriting uneven, letters squeezed together as if even my pen had been unsure of what I wanted to say. When the door finally opened, she stepped out with a kind of calm that seemed rehearsed, yet effortless. Her presence didn't feel like that of a traditional therapist. There was no lab coat, no thick glasses, no wall of degrees behind her. She was young, far younger than I had expected, with soft features, clear eyes, and a quiet focus that made me feel both exposed and seen. She greeted me with a gesture, and I stood too fast, knocking my knee against the corner of the side table. I muttered an apology I'm not sure she heard. I followed her into the room, heart drumming. Her office was small, almost too cozy. No desk, just a few chairs, a soft rug, shelves with plants that looked too alive for a therapist's space. There was no tension in the room, but I carried enough of it inside me to saturate the air. I chose the chair furthest from hers, though I could feel her gaze tracing the space between us, like a seam she might one day pull loose. She started slow, asking about my background, my stress, my reasons for coming. I gave the standard responses: midlife fatigue, insomnia, a low buzz of anxiety that never quite turned off. I avoided specifics. I used words like tired and overwhelmed and numb because they were vague enough to be safe. She nodded thoughtfully, legs crossed, one hand holding a pen she barely used. I noticed the curve of her wrist, the stillness in her posture. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fill the silence when I faltered. She let it sit there, heavy, pushing at the edges of my discomfort. At one point, I looked at the ceiling, counting the recessed lights, trying to keep my emotions inside the well-worn perimeter I'd built over years of self-containment. But something in her expression, neutral, open, relentlessly calm, began to chip away at the walls. My words came out in fits and fragments, and I kept waiting for her to correct me, challenge me, dissect me. She didn't. Instead, she asked if I was open to a different kind of approach. My shoulders tensed. I asked what she meant, though I already knew it wouldn't be standard. There was something about her that didn't align with the textbooks and therapy sessions I'd half-heartedly endured before. She explained she worked with somatic methods, body-based practices to help reconnect with sensation, memory, and self. I nodded as if I understood. I didn't, but I said yes. She explained a grounding exercise. Simple, she said, something to help me become more aware of how my body held tension. I was to close my eyes, breathe, and focus on each area of my body, starting from the crown of my head down to the soles of my feet. Her voice guided me, low and even, and for the first time in weeks, my thoughts began to slow. I became aware of the tightness in my chest, the rigid way my knees pressed together, the tremble in my fingertips. I followed her instruction, but every time she paused, I could hear her breath, soft and steady, close enough to picture. I told myself it was normal. She was young, yes, but trained. Calm didn't mean seductive. Still, my awareness began to shift, not just inward, but outward. I became attuned to the air between us, the faint warmth radiating from her chair, the scent of her lotion, something botanical and soft, maybe lavender or neroli. My skin reacted before my mind did. A flush rose in my neck, and I opened my eyes slightly to ground myself, but the sight of her, sitting across from me with one leg tucked beneath her, head tilted slightly, watching me, not as a therapist, but as a woman, threw me off balance. She smiled gently, encouraging me to keep going. I closed my eyes again and forced myself to breathe, to return to the body. But I was no longer just tracking my breath. I was tracking hers, too. When the session ended, she thanked me for my trust, said I'd done well. I nodded, struggling to meet her eyes. I left the room walking too fast, my legs shaky, as if I'd stepped into something much deeper than I'd anticipated. Later, alone in my car, I stared at the steering wheel for a long time. I couldn't stop thinking about her voice, her posture, the heat I felt spreading through my chest when her voice dropped at the end of each sentence. I told myself I was overreacting, projecting, spiraling, but my body knew something my mind refused to admit. I had walked into that room looking for clarity. Instead, I had walked into something that felt like a current, slow, quiet, and unmistakably dangerous. And part of me already wanted to go back. The second session felt different before it even began. I arrived early, parking on the far side of the lot to give myself a few extra minutes of stillness. But stillness didn't come. My hands gripped the steering wheel long after the engine was off, my chest tight with anticipation I couldn't quite name. The memory of our first meeting clung to me, not in words, but in sensations. The way her voice had moved through the air, the way her presence had carved space around me, the way my body had reacted without permission. I had told myself it was nothing, a blip, a chemical misfire. But I was here again. And I was here early. When I finally walked into the building, the receptionist wasn't at her desk. The lights were dimmer than last time. The same faint scent of eucalyptus lingered, now mixed with something warmer, like vanilla or amber. The silence felt thicker, like the walls were holding a secret. When the door to her office opened, I didn't stand right away. I looked up at her from the waiting room chair, expecting her to look different somehow. She didn't. She wore the same quiet ease, the same soft sweater, the same steady gaze that made me feel like I had nowhere to hide. Inside the office, everything was just as I remembered it. The plants still looked too alive. The rug was still soft. The light filtered through sheer curtains and golden strands that made the space feel womb-like. She asked how I was, and I gave her a short, practiced answer. I didn't elaborate. I couldn't, because what I really wanted to say wasn't about stress or sleep or work. It was about her hands, her eyes, the low frequency of her presence that had somehow taken up residence in the space between my shoulder blades. She didn't press. Instead, she gestured for me to sit on the floor. The rug, she explained, would support me better for the next part of our work. Something new, something deeper, a somatic awareness exercise. She called it tuning in. I didn't question her. I sat cross-legged on the floor, adjusting the hem of my blouse and smoothing my skirt over my knees, suddenly hyper-aware of every crease in the fabric, every inch of skin it covered. She moved with practiced grace, kneeling across from me, her hands resting on her thighs, her posture open but deliberate. She spoke softly, guiding me to close my eyes, to breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth. I obeyed, letting the rhythm settle into my bones. She told me to bring attention to my body, to notice where I held tension. I tried. My jaw, my shoulders, the back of my neck, all taut. I noticed, too, the heaviness low in my abdomen, a coil of something unspoken. Then she said she would be guiding me with touch, if that felt safe. Her tone was clinical, professional, but something in the way the words sat in the air made my skin prickle. I hesitated. Then I nodded. Her hands landed lightly on my shoulders, warm and present. They didn't move at first, just rested there, anchoring me. My body reacted instantly, not with fear, but with heat. Her touch was firm but gentle, grounding, and somehow intimate in a way I couldn't explain. She asked me to notice the sensation. I did. I noticed everything. The weight of her hands, the space where her fingers curled just slightly, the brush of her sleeve against the side of my neck. My breath hitched, but I said nothing. She moved slowly, hands gliding down to my upper arms, pausing, then continuing to my elbows. She told me to keep breathing. I tried. I focused on the sensation of her skin through the thin fabric of my blouse. Her fingers spread slightly as they traveled, and when they reached my forearms, I felt something tighten in my chest. Not anxiety, not fear, hunger. She shifted positions, kneeling behind me now. I heard the sound of her knees brushing the rug, felt her presence at my back. Her hands returned to my shoulders, then slid down my spine, not quite touching skin, but close enough to feel the warmth of her through the fabric. She spoke softly about the body's memory, about how we carry emotion in places we don't expect. Her fingertips rested at the small of my back, and I had to press my lips together to stay silent. She asked if I could feel my hips on the floor, if I could feel the weight of my thighs. I nodded, but the awareness wasn't neutral anymore. It pulsed. My thighs tingled. My hands curled slightly in my lap. Her voice dropped, slower now, drawing out each word like a ribbon. She placed her palm flat against the center of my back, and I felt my body lean into it, involuntarily, like a flower to the sun. Then her hand moved, just a few inches, but it traced a line that left fire in its wake. Downward, just along the spine, then outward across the curve of my waist. I didn't know what to do with the way my body responded. I told myself this was therapeutic, necessary, but the warmth pulling in my abdomen didn't feel like healing. It felt like longing. She paused again. Her breath was near my ear now. I could feel it, soft and warm. She guided me to bring attention to my chest, my heart, the rhythm of my breath. I realized then that my breathing had become shallow, my ribs barely expanding. She asked if I could place my own hand there, over my sternum. I did, hesitantly. Then she placed her hand over mine. Her skin against mine, even through my blouse, was enough to send a shiver down my spine. Her palm pressed lightly, not enough to restrict, just enough to be known. I felt her breath again, this time at the nape of my neck, and my thighs pressed closer together. Not consciously, not to resist, to contain. She said nothing for a long time. Neither did I. Her hand over mine, her body behind mine, the rug beneath me, the air thick and silent. It felt like a moment suspended outside of time, like something ancient and sacred had been unearthed and placed gently between us. Eventually, she withdrew. Her hand slipped away from mine slowly, like water draining from a cupped palm. She told me to take my time opening my eyes. I did, and when I looked at her, she was back in her original spot, legs crossed, hands folded gently in her lap, face unreadable but calm. I left the session unsure of what had happened. It hadn't been sexual, but it hadn't not been. Something inside me had stirred, opened, and now refused to be closed again. I told myself I was imagining it, that she was simply good at what she did, that I had projected my own confusion onto a method designed to help me connect with myself. But when I stood up and saw the slight curve of her lips, the almost imperceptible tilt of her head as she watched me leave, I knew I wasn't imagining anything. My body had heard her, and something inside me had already started to answer. I didn't schedule the next session right away. I lingered in hesitation, oscillating between reason and craving, telling myself I needed space to think, to process, to ground myself. But the silence that followed was louder than anything. It wasn't absence I felt. It was withdrawal, like something vital had been removed. I found myself replaying her voice in my mind, recalling the weight of her touch, the exact pressure of her hand over mine, the scent of her skin as she moved behind me. It wasn't just memory anymore. It was ache, a physical longing that settled in the marrow of my bones and whispered its way through my day. Days passed before I messaged her, a short note typed and erased multiple times until it was so neutral it bordered on empty. She replied quickly, too quickly. Her words polite, professional, but there was something between the lines, an implied warmth, an opening. She offered a new appointment. I accepted. The moment I sent the confirmation, my heart pounded with both anticipation and dread. I was walking back towards something I didn't understand, but needed. When I arrived, I noticed the door to her office was already slightly ajar. Inside, the lights were low again, but softer this time, not dim, warm, inviting. She greeted me as if nothing had happened, as if the last session had been exactly what it was supposed to be. I sat on the rug again, without prompting. It felt natural now, like ritual. She joined me with a fluid grace, legs folding beneath her, as though the ground had always been her domain. There were no introductions this time, no check-in. She asked if I was ready to begin, and I simply nodded. She started with breath work. Slow, deep inhales, full exhales, the kind that pull you into your own chest and hold you there. I followed her rhythm. I watched her lungs rise and fall, the slow expansion beneath her sweater, and I mirrored her, trying not to let my gaze linger too long. She invited me to scan my body, to notice tension, pressure, sensation. I did as she asked, but it wasn't my own body I was aware of. It was hers. The shape of her mouth when she exhaled, the gentle arch of her spine as she leaned forward slightly, the way her fingers curved when she rested them on her knees. I wasn't in my body. I was circling hers. Then she shifted closer, just a few inches. Her knees brushed mine. She placed her hands palm up on the floor between us and asked me to do the same. Our fingers aligned but didn't touch, not yet. She told me to observe what it felt like to share space, to sense the energy of another body without engaging directly. I did, and it burned. The tension between our fingertips was unbearable, static, waiting for permission. She guided me through another body scan. This time, her voice was even lower, barely more than breath. She instructed me to bring awareness to my chest, my stomach, my pelvis. Words spoken slowly, deliberately. She told me to notice any sensation, any reaction, and to sit with it. The moment she said that, I felt the pressure between my thighs return, a dull throb, a warmth that spread like a secret. I tried to stay still, but my breath hitched. She must have noticed. I saw her eyes flick down, then up again. She didn't say anything, but she didn't have to. She asked if I was open to guided touch again. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She moved behind me, slowly, placing her hands on my shoulders as she had before. I closed my eyes, letting the familiarity settle. But this time, her touch was different. Not firmer, not softer, just more intentional. Her fingers traced slow, lazy lines down the tops of my arms, paused, then slid inward toward my ribs. I felt her breath on the back of my neck. The space between us dissolved. I wasn't just being touched, I was being read. Her palm settled just under my shoulder blades, gently pressing, drawing awareness to my spine. She asked me to breathe into that space. I tried, but the breath caught again, high in my throat. She didn't speak. She simply moved her hands lower, along the curve of my waist, resting at the top of my hips. My entire body tensed, then softened. Her thumbs drew tiny circles there, grounding, hypnotic. I couldn't move. I didn't want to. Then her fingers skimmed just beneath the hem of my blouse, brushing bare skin. The contact sent a jolt through me, not fear, but recognition. My hands remained limp in my lap, my eyes still closed, the breath coming short and shallow. She didn't push. She stayed there, unmoving, her hands open and still, resting on the edges of permission. When I opened my eyes, the room felt dimmer, as if something had shifted in the air itself. She moved back in front of me, sitting cross-legged, her knees once again touching mine. Her eyes met mine, holding the silence between us like a question. I looked down at her hands, then up again, and in that moment, I felt something inside me unravel. I reached out. Not much, just enough to let my fingers brush the top of her wrist. Her skin was warm, pulsing, alive. She didn't pull away, but she didn't move closer either. She simply held that moment with me. I felt the boundary blur, not snap, like fog lifting from glass. We weren't therapist and client anymore. We were something else, something unnamed, unspoken, suspended in the space where rules dissolve. She finally spoke, telling me to take a deep breath, to come back to the room. But I didn't want to. I didn't want to leave whatever place we had just stepped into. I followed her instruction anyway. I inhaled, exhaled, but nothing felt the same. My body was still buzzing, my thoughts scattered. She ended the session like any other, gentle voice, a nod, a reminder to hydrate. But when I stood, I noticed how close she had come without ever really touching me, and how far I had gone without taking a single step. That night, lying in bed, I couldn't sleep. I kept feeling her hands on me, not in memory, but in echo. I replayed every inch of the session, trying to convince myself it had been therapeutic, clinical, necessary. But that was a lie. I knew the difference. My body knew the difference. And somewhere deep beneath all the layers I had carefully built, I knew I wanted more. The night air felt denser than usual as I walked up the quiet path to her office. The streets were nearly empty, the windows of nearby buildings glowing dimly, casting long reflections on the pavement. The world seemed paused, suspended in some delicate silence, and I felt like I was stepping out of reality and into something I wasn't meant to name. She had offered a later appointment, said her schedule was tight, but I knew it wasn't about time. It was about privacy, darkness, intimacy. When I entered the building, the hallways were hushed and empty. The overhead lights were off, replaced by the soft flicker of warm lamps behind closed doors. Her office door was slightly open, the same way it had been the last time, as if she wanted me to step into something already in motion. Inside, the room had changed. The rug had been replaced with a larger one, plush and darker in tone, as if it had been chosen to absorb not just sound, but secrets. The curtains were drawn. The only light came from a few low lamps and candles placed carefully around the space, their glow soft and golden, flickering shadows on the ceiling. She stood barefoot by the window, arms crossed loosely, her back partially turned to me. She was dressed differently. No cardigan, no business casual blouse, just a simple tank top and loose drawstring pants that hugged her hips and swayed gently as she turned. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Everything about the room spoke for her. The heat, the softness, the deliberate quiet. I felt myself change the moment I stepped inside. I was no longer a client. I was something else. I closed the door behind me, and the lock clicked with the finality of a choice. She gestured toward the rug, and I sat without thinking, legs folded, hands in my lap, trying to appear composed, though my pulse throbbed at the base of my neck. She moved around the room slowly, lighting another candle, adjusting a throw blanket on the nearby chair, letting the space fill with the scent of amber and sandalwood. My body responded before my thoughts could catch up. A low ache stirred between my thighs, and I shifted slightly, trying to mask it with a breath that came out too shallow. She walked toward me and sat on the rug, closer than usual, knees nearly touching mine. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was rich, pulsing, expectant. She told me we would continue our somatic work, but in a more immersive way. I nodded, not trusting my voice. She asked if I was comfortable with physical guidance again. My body answered before my mind did. I reached out and placed my hands in my lap, but they trembled slightly, betraying the calm I tried to present. She leaned forward, placing her palms on my knees, grounding me. Her eyes held mine, not in question, but in confirmation. Her thumbs moved in slow circles, drawing heat through the thin fabric of my pants, and I felt myself sway slightly toward her. She guided me to lie back on the rug, and I obeyed, watching the ceiling lights flicker through the candle shadows. She knelt beside me and placed her hand flat over my abdomen, just below my ribs. The contact was firm, familiar, but this time it lingered. Her other hand came to rest on my sternum, warm and steady. I felt held, anchored, exposed. Then her touch began to change. Slowly, she slid her hands down my sides, over the curve of my waist, her fingers tracing light patterns that made my skin spark. She moved with precision, like someone exploring not just a body, but a language written beneath it. I closed my eyes and let the sensations rise. My breath grew uneven. She brushed the hem of my shirt upward, exposing the flesh beneath, and paused. I didn't stop her. I didn't speak. My silence became permission. She lifted my shirt higher, folding it gently, just below my chest, her fingers grazing the sides of my ribs, making me shiver. Her mouth followed, lips pressing softly against my stomach, then higher, slowly tracing a line up the center of my body. My hands gripped the rug. The room had narrowed to the warmth of her breath, the slow rhythm of her movements, the press of her body leaning over mine. She undid the button of my pants with practiced ease and pulled them down just enough to reveal skin she hadn't touched before. Her hands moved with reverence, not haste. She caressed the tops of my thighs, her thumbs drawing slow arcs over sensitive skin, coaxing tension from places I didn't know held it. Then she lowered her mouth again. Her lips brushed the inside of my hip just once, then again, slower this time, leaving a heat that burned into me. My back arched in response, involuntary, desperate. She lifted herself and moved above me, her knees straddling my hips, her body folding over mine as her hands framed my face. Her skin was warm against my neck, her breath thick with intention. She kissed me, full, slow, deep. Her tongue slid past my lips with a softness that broke something open inside me. I wrapped my arms around her, fingers digging into her back, anchoring myself to her weight, her presence. My body was no longer mine. It was fluid, yielding, starved. She undressed me slowly, layer by layer, her hands unhurried, her gaze unwavering. She watched me as if memorizing every shift in breath, every curve of skin. When I was bare beneath her, she stood and pulled her own top over her head. Her body was lit by the candlelight, shadows dancing over the lines of her collarbone, her stomach, the soft swell of her breasts. She knelt again, her hands gliding down my sides, then up my thighs, parting them with silent command. Her mouth found me with a hunger I hadn't known she carried. Her tongue moved in slow, devastating patterns, teasing, pressing, retreating, returning. My hands tangled in her hair. My thighs trembled around her shoulders. I cried out, soft, broken, primal. She held me there, grounded me with her mouth, her fingers digging gently into my hips as she moved deeper, faster, until the edges of the room disappeared, and I was nothing but sound and heat and the pressure of release building until it spilled out of me in waves. When she moved back up, she kissed me again, slower this time, tasting me, filling my mouth with everything I couldn't say. She curled beside me, pulling a blanket over us. Her body pressed into mine, skin to skin, heartbeat to heartbeat. I felt her fingers trace lazy patterns along my arm, her lips resting just below my ear. I was raw, wide open, and yet more held than I had ever been. The night lingered in silence. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The boundary had not just been crossed, it had been erased. And now, in the thick quiet of that dim room, lying on the rug where I had once come for healing, I realized something irreversible had taken root. I had given her access not just to my body, but to something far more fragile, something I wasn't sure how to reclaim. I woke the next morning to a strange silence in my body. Not peace, not clarity, just a stillness that felt artificial, like the surface of water right before it's broken by something rising from below. My limbs ached with softness, the kind that follows deep release, but my thoughts were tangled. I lay in bed for a long time, staring at the ceiling, unable to move. My skin still smelled like her. The taste of her still lingered faintly on the inside of my mouth. I closed my eyes, willing the memory to dissipate, but it only grew sharper, louder. The weight of her body, the rhythm of her breath, the tremble in her hands when she moved inside me. It was all there, as vivid as the pillow beneath my cheek. I got up eventually and moved through my apartment in a kind of daze. The kettle whistled, and I forgot I had turned it on. I opened the fridge and stared inside, unable to remember what I had wanted. I touched the side of my neck where her lips had lingered the night before and felt a pulse flutter beneath my skin. Everything around me felt slightly off-kilter, like the world had shifted while I wasn't looking. I avoided mirrors. I didn't want to see myself in this new version, this version that had given in, fully, willingly. Throughout the day, her presence clung to me like humidity. I heard her voice in the cadence of other people's words, caught her scent in strangers who passed too close. My phone buzzed several times, but none of the messages were from her. I didn't know whether I wanted them to be. I thought about writing to her, just a simple thank you or some innocuous comment to test the distance between us now. But my fingers hovered above the screen and never moved. Anything I said would be too much, or not enough. By evening, the quiet became unbearable. I poured myself a glass of wine and sat on the floor, back against the wall, legs stretched out in front of me. I stared at nothing, just breathing, trying to find the edge of what I was feeling. Guilt had settled in the hollow beneath my ribs, slow and heavy. Not guilt about what we had done, not entirely, but guilt about what it had awakened. I had crossed a threshold I couldn't uncross. I had stepped out of the role I had been assigned and into something feral, something unbound. And I liked it, but I also hated myself for liking it. The next morning, I went through my usual routine with practiced mechanical detachment. I dressed carefully, avoiding the softer fabrics that reminded me too much of how her hands had moved across my body. I brushed my hair into a neat twist, as if order could somehow push away the chaos inside. I told myself it was just one night, one lapse, one beautiful, terrifying unraveling. But it was more than that. I knew it even then. I didn't book another appointment, not right away. Days passed, then a week. I thought distance would help. That space would cool whatever had ignited between us. But the opposite happened. The absence became unbearable. I would lie in bed and replay everything, her voice, her touch, the way she looked at me as she slid my shirt over my head like she was undressing a memory. My body began to crave her, and not just in the dark. I would feel it in the grocery store, reaching for fruit, suddenly remembering the pressure of her lips on my thigh. Or at work, typing emails, and her fingers would flash behind my eyes, tracing the inside of my wrist. I began to feel like a stranger inside my own skin. Then came the message. From her. Casual, almost indifferent. Checking in, she said. No mention of what had happened. No acknowledgement of the night that had folded us into one body and then unstitched us in silence. I stared at it for hours, rereading it as if it held some hidden code. I didn't respond. I couldn't. Her nonchalance burned. I had been undone, and she was asking how my week was going. Eventually, I wrote back. Something polite, measured, empty. She replied, just as cool, suggesting another session. I didn't say yes. I didn't say no. I simply stared at the message and felt something inside me twist. A few days later, I received another message, not from her, from a woman I didn't know. She said she was reaching out because her daughter had been seeing my therapist, that she'd found my name listed in an old shared resource file, that she didn't know what to do because her daughter had become different, distant, confused, obsessive. She said there had been things her daughter had shared about touch, about closeness, that didn't sound like therapy anymore. I froze. My fingers went numb around the phone. My breath caught. I read the message again and again. My skin turned cold. My chest burned. It wasn't just me. I thought I was unique, that our connection had been singular, sacred, but I wasn't the exception. I was a pattern, a number, a method. My stomach turned. My mind began to retrace every moment, not with longing now, but with dread. I remembered the practiced way she moved, the silence she held, the language she used to guide me further, deeper, until I thought I was healing, until I thought I was choosing. But I wasn't choosing. I had been chosen, groomed, nudged, slowly, across every line until there were none left to protect me. I didn't sleep that night. I lay awake, sheets tangled around my legs, eyes wide in the dark, every nerve in my body still humming with memory and shame. I thought about going to someone, telling, naming, but the words felt heavy, like they would betray something too intimate, too broken. So I did nothing. I stared into the dark and let it swallow me. The next morning, I looked in the mirror for the first time in days. My face looked older, my eyes harder. The softness she had pulled from me was gone. In its place was something raw, hollow, and cold. And yet, beneath all of it, shamefully, terribly, a small part of me still wanted to feel her hands again. That was the worst part. I couldn't tell if I hated her more for what she did or myself for missing it. I didn't tell anyone, not right away, not because I didn't want to, not because I didn't think I should, but because I didn't have the language. There were no neat categories for what had happened, no easy terms to describe a violation that came wrapped in warmth. What we did, what she did, had lived in that tender space between comfort and confusion, between healing and hunger. I carried it in silence, letting it press deeper into my chest until it became part of how I breathed, a hidden frequency I couldn't turn off. The days moved forward like nothing had happened, but I wasn't inside them. I was watching myself move, watching my hands pour coffee, watching my mouth speak in meetings, watching my body shower, dress, fold laundry. Everything felt thin, like paper pressed over glass. I could feel the edges of the truth just beneath the surface, sharp and waiting. I avoided mirrors again. I avoided people. I answered text with vague sentences, gave nods instead of explanations, and laughed at things I didn't hear. I kept her name in my throat like a shard, and I didn't speak it. I wanted to forget, but my body wouldn't let me, not fully. I still woke in the middle of the night with the echo of her mouth on my skin, her breath warm against the shell of my ear. I would reach for the other side of the bed, even though I knew it would be empty. Then I would lie back, flat and motionless, staring at the ceiling until morning pulled me into its indifferent arms. The woman who messaged me didn't follow up. Maybe she sensed my silence was an answer. Maybe she had already reached her own conclusions. But her words remained lodged in me like a splinter. They rewrote the narrative I had built, this secret, forbidden romance I had tried to romanticize, to justify, to protect. Suddenly, I wasn't the center of a tragic love story. I was a data point in a pattern, a link in a chain I had never seen being forged. I thought about the others, not with jealousy, but with horror. How many women had sat on that same rug, feeling safe, feeling seen, feeling like they were finally being held after years of loneliness? How many had left with that same ache in their chest, that same glowing shame tangled with desire? How many had been told that touch was a part of healing, that arousal was a natural response, that boundaries were constructs meant to be explored? I couldn't breathe when I thought about it. I couldn't tell if I had been seduced or studied, but the outcome was the same. One evening, I stood in the bathroom with the medicine cabinet open, staring at the bottle of sleeping pills I hadn't used in months. I wasn't planning anything drastic. I just wanted silence, a real one, not the kind that fills the room with what if and why her and maybe it was me. I wanted one night without her voice brushing through my thoughts like fingertips. I took one pill, then another, then lay down and let the world blur. I dreamed of her, but not the way I wanted to. In the dream, she stood across the room from me, holding my blouse in her hands, folding it slowly, precisely, like it was something delicate she had borrowed. When she handed it back, it was wet. I woke in a sweat, heart pounding, the sheets twisted around me like restraints. My mouth was dry, my chest hollow. There was no rest in that sleep, just more fragments. Eventually, I began to write. Not stories, not journal entries, lists, names of feelings, triggers, smells, the order in which she had undressed me, the phrases she used, how her fingers felt when they slid over my hips, the sound of her swallowing between breaths. I listed everything like evidence, trying to force my brain to see it all as real, as factual, as unacceptable. But halfway through each list, the ink would trail off, the words would blur, and I would find myself curled up in the chair, knees to chest, crying into the side of my hand. I never reported her. I rehearsed it in my head, how I would walk in, what I would say, the tone I'd use. But the moment I imagined their faces, imagined the cold, curious looks of strangers trying to piece together Whether I had consented or not, whether I had wanted it, my stomach twisted. I couldn't bear the weight of being examined like that, judged, dissected. I had already lost too much of myself. I wasn't sure what would be left if I gave it all away. So I held the secret close, let it rot quietly inside me, and like most buried things, it started to change me. I stopped dating. I stopped responding to invitations. I stopped touching people casually. A hand on my shoulder would send ice shooting down my spine. A compliment would make me flush, then retreat. I began to dress differently. Layers, high collars, loose fabrics that didn't cling. I removed photos from shelves. I threw away the candles that reminded me of her office. I deleted old texts, archived emails, but no matter how much I erased, she remained in the folds of my memory, persistent and soft and cruel. Then one day, I saw her. Not up close, not in a room, on the street. I was leaving a bookstore when I spotted her across the road, walking beside another woman. She laughed, her head tilted the same way it had tilted when she looked at me. The woman beside her was younger, open-faced, relaxed. I stopped walking. My legs went numb. The moment lasted only seconds, but it opened something raw and sharp in me. I turned around and walked the other way, fast, my hands shaking, my throat burning. I wanted to scream, not at her, at myself, for still needing her, for still wondering if she ever thought about me, for wanting her to look up, see me, and react. But she didn't. She never saw me, and maybe she never truly had. That night, I wrote a final entry in my notebook, just one line. She touched my body and called it healing. I touched hers and called it love. Neither of us told the truth. Then I closed the notebook, placed it on a high shelf, and turned off the light. The secret didn't leave, but it stopped screaming. It became a low hum in the background of my life, a frequency only I could hear, a reminder of how easily intimacy can be weaponized, and how some wounds don't bleed but still scar you from the inside out.